Hello, I am Ludovic Karga. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this seminar, to this workshop. I work for the Orange Group. I specialize in energy and environment issues, and in particular on the issues of the impact of artificial intelligence and generative AI. In particular, tonight I will try to show you that today the development of artificial intelligence is at such a pace that potentially we will be forced to make trade-offs and try to understand how we can organize ourselves to make these trade-offs. First of all, we must understand that we are in a context. Very constrained global, the energy transition, and especially the transition to guarantee global warming that is not too high, requires us to take a certain number of actions. So here I present the strategy of France, but it works roughly for almost all other countries in the same way. It's not necessarily the same pace, it's not necessarily exactly the same proportions, but the order of magnitude. The orders of magnitude are almost always the same. Okay, so what we need to understand is that in order to deal with the subject of climate change, one of the major battle plans of the subject is both to get rid of fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and we don't know how to do it before 2050. It is at the same time to have systems that we very efficient Dundee energy view for. Reduce our energy consumption and at the same time electrify our uses. So moving from objects or processes that were heavily consuming fossil energy to processes that heavily use electricity. Typically, when I switch from a gasoline car to an electric car, I am in the electrification of uses. When I switch from a pump, from a gas boiler, and I switch to a heat pump, I am in the electrification of uses. And then there are a whole bunch of industrial mechanisms that also use fossil fuels. But that's the principle. The battle plan is to electrify uses, which means that we will have to do it massively and quickly. Why quickly? Because we are already in 2025 and 2050 is only 25 years away, and a complete electrical system takes time because it is an infrastructure that is extremely heavy and it takes decades to get an electrical system moving. Well, we know how to be too fast, but despite everything there is real inertia. Consequently, the climatic context imposes a forced electrification of uses, when at the same time we have new technologies arriving and which can, if they are not well organized, thwart this transition approach in summer. Let me explain. We've always had new techno. And every time we've had new technologies, we've found ourselves in a situation where this new technology, in a few years, became indispensable. I can't do without it anymore. That was the case with the phone. It was also the case for cinema, which we didn't really know what to do with when it was invented. What did we say? That it says we'll be able to do with it. And yet, now it is globally acquired for everyone. When cell phones arrived, we had exactly the same phenomenon. But what is this object there? It'll never work, it'll never work, it'll never work. And yet today we find ourselves in a situation where we no longer know how to do without. We had exactly the same situation with the web. Who in the beginning? Well, we didn't really know what we could do with it, and which today is totally indispensable to our modern societies. If tonight we cut the web, well, many processes stop right now. More TV, more computer, more mobile phone, more industrial process, more remote control, water tower, more remote control of electrical transformer. In short, more web. Big problem. And at the same time, we have a new technology that is coming. So AI and generative AI in particular, which is coming very quickly and potentially. One wonders why they are going to become very quickly. Essential or not really? Why? because we have a climate context that is. Having said that, today, what we see is that more and more technologies are being developed, and especially in the IT. And these IT technologies are consuming more and more electricity. Now, I told you earlier that electrical systems are growing or transforming slowly. The electricity sector must grow rapidly and transform rapidly when at the same time we have an IT sector which is developing very rapidly and whose needs are increasing even faster with the generalization of AI and generative AI. And therefore, on this graph, you see a report in the summer. Who is from the semiconductor industry? Who says that, roughly speaking, we find ourselves in a situation where we have a system, an electrical system, which is increasing, but in a limited way, when at the same time we have an extremely rapid expansion of AI and generative AI, and potentially we can have a crossing of the curves. So exactly, we will not be able to consume more energy than we produce or electricity. And so as a consequence, we could find ourselves in a situation where AI and generative AI monopolize a very, very large part of the world's electricity, which means that we might not make the transition, which wouldn't be very pleasant from a climate perspective. And at the same time, it could even monopolize a whole bunch of things, including our fridge, which could bother us to stock turkey for Christmas. And so we are facing a situation of very rapid transition with very rapid growth of the IT sector in general. And as a result, are we not in a situation where we are already in a situation of fragility? The question is, are we in a fragile state? Have we looked at what is happening in the press? Do we have any signs of weakness or competition? Well, in fact, when you look, there are small indicators. Typically, you can see that large data operators, so GAFAM in general, but there are others because it works with all data center manufacturers. Today, we already have large operators starting to buy. Electricity production activities to ensure that they have the electricity in accordance with their own needs. So some buy existing nuclear power plants to restart them. Others say, I will use a new technology which is called the small modular reactor to be able to have electricity supply in a secure manner. This is what is happening now and is being seen in a lot of other sectors. But the electrification of uses, physics is cruel. To have electricity, you have to have cables, and to have cables, you have to have copper. However, today the copper sector has been under tension for several years due to strong demand linked to the energy transition. And that pressure comes. Is to be increased because of the additional pressure linked to digital players, a live mains that receives additional voltage. And that's not all. We are not just dealing with a copper problem, but we are also dealing with electrical transformers, because electrical transformers, we need them a lot to be able to develop wind turbines, to be able to develop photovoltaic panels. But at the same time, we need it a lot to make data centers, and in particular very high power data centers of 1 gigawatt, as we can start to see them. And so we find ourselves in a situation where we have a tension on the capacity to produce electricity. We have a tension on the metallic resource. Will the flow be sufficient compared to the demand? And we have a tension including on the flow of electrical equipment necessary for the transition, and to the IT sector. And when we combine all these parameters, we realize that we have some weak signals which can put us in global tension. But what is worse, I dare say, is that given the tension on the sector to be able to produce electricity, we do not hesitate to say it is not serious. We will slow down the closure of coal-fired power plants, which is a very serious danger linked to climate change. Because we absolutely need to shut down all coal-fired power plants as quickly as possible to limit global warming to sufficiently satisfactory degrees of temperature to watch complex human systems. So we find ourselves in a situation where we already have weak signals that bring us to a situation where we can feel that if we continue at the pace we are at, or if we accelerate the pace we are at, we could immediately find ourselves in situations of either hoarding or shortage. So the hoarding is for one side, and the shortage is the one who suffers the negative counterpart of the situation. What does that mean? That means we're probably going to have to make some choices. In reality, AI and generative AI actually have a positive potential contributory role. You can do a lot of things that you couldn't do before. Generative AI opens up an extraordinary field of possibilities. On the other hand, if generative AI is generalized to all subjects and everyone, a high risk is identified. Two strong constraints on electrical production and on electrical production and distribution. And therefore it will probably be necessary in the years to come, and even very quickly, because the sector moves a lot, to have discernment in the uses that we choose on this new technology. It is likely that we will not be able to actually generalize these tools there. Let me give you an example from Orange. We sought to use generative AI to make classification. We could have used a classic AI with a classic Berthe method. There you go. And actually, we used both methods, and we looked at what was the electrical impact of those two methods to render the same agreement service. And when we did some calculations, we realized that generative IA was much simpler to do this classification. And so when it's simpler, it's very tempting to use it for a result that was slightly lower than the classical classification. But the fact that it's simpler and a very close result, well, we were very motivated to use technologies related to generative. Except that Dundee view electricity consumption, and we checked the figures to ensure that we did not make a mistake in our measurements. We realized that between this classic AI Berthe method versus classification with a generative AI that is simple to use with similar performances, consume 100,000 times more electricity. I repeat, 100,000 times more electricity. As a result, the technique is extremely interesting, except that its impact, both on environmental, but just at least on human power grid systems, and incommensurate with other techniques. And that potentially, if we generalize this technique, we have an enormous risk. I will take a parallel that is very simple. Before, in 1900, nobody had a car when you wanted to go get your baguette. Because I am a good Frenchman, I will get my bread baguette with my beret. I will go there on foot or by bike, because my baker was 2 miles away. Today we have cars and we always go for the breadstick, but we take the car. It's much more impactantun. From a material point of view, much more impactantun dot from an energy point of view. But because it is simpler and faster, we do it. And so there is very little chance that we will deprive ourselves of using generative AI to do very things. Very simply, very easily, even though it consumes much more, except that it's going to be extremely tempting to do it, and at the same time the fact that it's tempting. But given its impact, well, it's likely that we won't be able to do it. So that means we will have to organize ourselves in our discernment. We won't be able to generalize generative IA because of this impact, but how do we do it? How do we choose? Is the priority to make a medical diagnosis or to optimize the cutting of the last shrub of the Amazon forest? I choose use cases voluntarily separating its sorting. For example, would I rather use my limited resources to do climate projection or fetch the last drop of oil from the last oil well? Is that what we want? Which one do we prefer? Do we prefer to use generative AI or AI in general to be able to optimize and serve the energy transition? Or on the contrary, is it considered that the main use of AI should be to create emojis of a cat dressed as a chef? And actually, for all of our uses, for all of our use cases, we're going to have to ask ourselves the question potentially, what value can it have? What does it allow me to solve as a problem that I could not solve before? And in this case, it is really relevant to do so. In any case, we will have to ask ourselves about the purpose of what we are doing. Is it really relevant to want to get the last drop of oil from the last oil well? The purpose, we will have to ask ourselves questions about it. We can actually choose, but above all, we will have to. Because, as I told you, the electrical impact is such, our electrical systems evolving over time in a long time. Well, in reality, the extremely rapid growth of generative images will not allow the electrical system to keep up with the pace without having shortages next to it. And this means that we have to organize it, because otherwise we will find ourselves having to organize a battle plan during a battle. That is to say, while we will have potential shortages or in any case serious conflicts of use over access to electricity. Is it better to be able to generate a cat emoji, or is it better to provide a CT scan or MRI for a medical diagnosis? The fridge versus here, and that's actually what is offered to us. Who is the construction site? Who is in front of us then? In France, we launched a few months ago, almost a year ago, with FNOR, which is a French standardization body, a project to define what frugal AI is, because we already didn't have the vocabulary to define it, and so we did. Simply because, you had to arrive with 100 industrialists, of research organizations and industry. We sat around the table and worked to try to identify a definition. This is a first definition, not completely perfect, but not completely imperfect either. But this is a first step. And this first step, it allowed what? It has made it possible to trigger new work at European level to work on the definition of frugal IA. And roughly speaking, one of the major issues that will be the most complicated thing, by the way, which is going to be dealt with, will be the purpose. The purpose of the IA. What do we want to do? What is its societal role? What is its societal utility? And we will have to ask ourselves the question. Because once we have asked ourselves the question, once we have succeeded in establishing a circle of reflection on discernment, I do it not just because it is good, but I do it because it is useful, because it brings progress. Well, at that moment, once we have succeeded in setting this framework, we will find ourselves in a situation where we will always do AI and always generative AI without any difficulty. But on the other hand, we will do it with discernment. We have them. We will do it in a fair way, in a correct way, in a well-established way. And there in reality, we will find ourselves in a situation where we will be able to have AI and at the same time not have a conflict of use over electricity. And so the question is, how can we organize ourselves to define these use cases? Well, typically, AFNOR matters, Europe matters, ISO matters. We could very well start work right now on the purpose of the uses of artificial intelligence to create a normative framework to say, here are the places where the sectors on which we say it's worth it to go there. So beyond sectors, all sectors, we can do generative AI on all sectors potentially. In reality, what is the impact of that, of this AI? And above all is what we consider to be a priority or not compared to other activities. And therefore, the ISO frameworks is ideal to be able to precisely ask ourselves the right questions of how do we put discernment in our decision-making processes. I'm done. If you listen to this video because I wasn't live, I guess I still haven't recovered electricity at home, considering the storm that blew this weekend in France. So I'm sorry. I had to make this recording a little bit of a disaster to be able to be present tonight. What is certain is that you can ask all the questions you want. I will try to answer it offline as I am not here tonight, but especially do not hesitate to contact me through the different channels by the workshop. I will try to answer as much as possible to the questions or give you sources to be able to go further. Thank you. Goodbye.